I'm now going to introduce Michelle Rich. Michelle is the Andrew Mellon Curatorial Fellow in Latin American Art at the San Antonio Museum of Art. She just came from the LA County Museum of Art to begin this fellowship. Dr. Rich has a PhD in anthropology from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Her research focuses on the site of El Peru Huaca in Petén, Guatemala. So we'll be looking at classic Maya in this lecture. Most recently, she has curated an exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the LA County Museum of Art, entitled Ancient Bodies, Archaeological Perspectives on Mesoamerican Figurines. She is also the author of essays and the co-editor of the recent book titled Archaeology at El Peru Huaca, Ancient Maya Performances of Ritual Memory and Power at the University, and it was published by the University of Arizona Press, 2014. And her most recent publication is an essay co-authored in Cambridge Archaeological Journal with Marilyn Mason and David Friedel. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Rich for her talk, A Maya Resurrection Ritual from Ground to Gallery.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here, everyone. Can I do this? I'm not very good at standing still. So I wanted to follow up our conversation earlier today with the Anthropology Club students by sharing something with you that Russ urged me to tell everyone, that in spite of having a PhD from SMU, I'm a first generation college graduate from my family. So, and to get a PhD, and let alone in something as crazy as archaeology, is really kind of fantastical. And I'm going to urge everyone out here to study your passion and follow your dreams, because you never know where it will take you. It might take you to the jungles of Guatemala, which was where I spent a great deal of time working with the El Peru Huaca Regional Archaeological Project. And I did change up my title a little bit. I think I flipped it around actually on my slide, From Ground to Gallery, Following the Path of an Ancient Maya Resurrection Ritual. And I'm going to take you through a whirlwind tour of my discovery of this narrative scene of 23 ceramic figurines and what has become of them since we excavated them. Next slide. So this is all in conjunction with the exhibition that you currently have here called Maya Hidden Worlds Revealed. This show was put together by the Science Museum of Minnesota. It's been traveling to different noteworthy museums for 5 years now, so it's a very special treat for you all to have that exhibition here. And if you haven't gone to explore it yet, I definitely urge you to do so. First, we'll start off kind of following up Dr. Sears with her laying a good groundwork for understanding the Maya. Thank you, Erin. And thank you for your pleasant introduction and for having me here today to share more with you about the Maya world. Just to frame this for everyone, we've got a time chart that gives you an idea of how Maya civilization compares to Aztec and Inca and other perhaps lesser known civilizations from across Mesoamerica, the Olmec, the Zapotec, and the people of Teotihuacan. Next slide. The chronological periods that we'll be talking about today, at least for my case at El Peru Huaca, is really what we call the late classic. And that is from about 600 to 900 AD, and that time frame has a little bit of wiggle room across the Maya area. Next slide. And again, here's us archaeologists, we love our maps. So here's another map of the Maya world: Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador. Next slide. And that whole region can be divided up into 3 different areas. We have the highlands down here, and then the lowlands, and this is the northern lowlands, and this is the southern lowlands. The site where I work is in the southern lowlands in Petén, Guatemala. Next slide. So I'll take you there right now, next slide, as we discuss the archaeological excavation of the figurines. So El Peru Huaca is right here. I'll just call it Huaca from now on. And we started working there as a project, the El Peru Huaca Regional Archaeological Project, in 2003. We are still there today, which is kind of a miracle, conducting any number of types of archaeological research. We have LIDAR that's being examined right now. We're doing settlement studies, we're doing monumental architecture excavations, which is what I focused on. Next slide. The site itself is located in the Laguna del Tigre National Park, which is in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. So we are in the middle of a protected area, although it's not always so well protected because we do have park invaders and poachers and looters that come into the park to carry out any number of illicit activities, including drug running. But we're surrounded by the animals that were meaningful and powerful for the ancient Maya, like scarlet macaws and jaguars. That's wonderful for us to be able to experience that. Next slide. And this is a map of the site itself. So this is a plan view that shows you the structures that are in the site center, just the core. We have this, so this is basically downtown Waka. And then we have settlement all the way around that, which is basically suburban and then rural Waka. And this is a DDM that shows you a different image of the same site. I've circled the Mirador group on both maps. That's the area where I did my research, and you can see, next slide, that the Mirador group looms over the ancient city of Waka. It would have been a very prominent place on the landscape. People would have referenced it every day. It would be like a skyscraper that you see in the morning, or another prominent aspect of the constructed landscape. Structure 01404 is the building on which we'll focus. Next slide. And these are some photos of structure 01404. Oftentimes, ancient Maya pyramids look like giant hills in the middle of the jungle with trees growing on them, etc. And here we've conducted a little bit of excavation at the frontal platform. It gives you an idea that there's some cut stone that remains standing. And different parts of the building, we were able to identify staircases and corners, and we were also able to identify that the structure itself was circular. And so you have this big frontal platform that's attached to this very large circular pyramid. Next slide. Here's another view of the pyramid. This is from the top down, and this is again the frontal platform and the main pyramid. Here's a profile view with these three burials denoted here in the frontal platform. We're going to talk about burial 39 today. Next slide. This is a top-down view of the excavation of burial 39. It's a masonry tomb chamber that included the remains of a ruler laid out on the funerary bench and surrounded by the types of objects that you would see in a sumptuous Maya royal burial. And we don't know who this person is, hence the unknown ruler. Next slide. This is a drawing of the burial itself. So here we have the funerary bench with the skeletal remains and an alley next to the bench that contained a number of ceramic vessels. We excavated not only shell and greenstone. These are jaguar phalanges that indicated that the individual was laid on a jaguar pelt or was wearing a jaguar cape, which is super cool. We also had stingray spines that are indicative of the bloodletting rituals that the Maya are fairly well known for. Next slide. And here's a sampling of some of the 33 ceramic vessels that we had in the tomb. Next slide. And 10 of them had hieroglyphic texts on them. And this is our project epigrapher, Stanley Genter, who maybe looks a little bit like an escaped convict right there, because it was a really hard field season that year. And he's with a fer-de-lance snake that they had just killed in camp. And anyway, we had 6 vessels that had names on them, but that doesn't help us figure out who's in that tomb. If you have 6 names, doesn't help you narrow it down. So we still don't know who's in the tomb, even though we have 6 individuals named on these vessels. Next slide. What is most recognized about this tomb are the ceramic figurines, and then there's one stone figurine that's kind of like the red-headed stepchild. Nobody cares about him as much as they care about this narrative scene of 23 ceramic figurines that are indeed amazing. So we'll talk less about the Olmec style figurine, although he is kind of my favorite. I know you're not supposed to have favorites if you're a parent, and I do consider these figurines my children. So, but he's my favorite. So we'll spend more time on the others though. Next slide. And in the tomb chamber itself, back to that drawing, that ever important archaeological drawing, the narrative scene of 23 ceramic figurines was laid at the foot end of the interment, whereas the Olmec style figurine was cached in 2 vessels in a lip-to-lip cache. And you can only imagine our surprise when we lifted the top lid off and saw this little Olmec style figurine in a Maya tomb. And just to kind of hit home, this tomb dates from about 600 to 650 AD. That figurine is easily, stylistically, 1,000 or more, 1,500 years earlier than this tomb. So we're talking about an heirloom of the greatest magnitude. Next slide. So let's talk about the figurine scene. Next slide. This is how it looked in the tomb. It's very hard to take sexy photos in tombs because everything's dirty and brown and it's dark, and it's a challenge. But you can imagine how we felt when we started uncovering this array of figurines that had been laid out by ancient mourners in a scene, signifying something. And I knew that as the director of the excavation that I had to do my utmost to ensure that this was excavated with the utmost care and concern for archaeological provenience or archaeological context. Where was this when it was found? That's essentially archaeological provenience. What is the relationship of all of the pieces to each other? So that was foremost on my mind. Next slide. The other thing that was on my mind was that across Mesoamerica through space and time, there really only have been maybe a dozen or so figurine scenes that have been archaeologically excavated. So this was a very rare discovery, and this is a smattering of some of those. Next slide. So we knew that this arrangement was a very rare occurrence to actually have the opportunity to archaeologically excavate this. Next slide. What we have here is a scene of courtiers, members of the royal court, who are attending the resurrection ritual of this deceased king, who is seated next to a deer, his animal spirit companion, who will help him in his journey through the underworld and to resurrection. Next slide. Here's a close-up of the deceased king who has his arms crossed in supplication, so a prayerful penitential pose. And the deer is almost whispering or talking to him, praying over him, if you will. But what I also like is that the deer is wearing a loincloth. And next slide, also wearing this pendant with a T-shaped symbol on it. And for the ancient Maya, that symbol meant ik, or wind, breath, or life. And we see this symbol quite a bit represented on pendants from different museum objects and archaeological discoveries. Here's some other examples of that. Next slide. So all of these other members of the royal court are there to witness and participate in this resurrection ceremony. Next slide. These include a king and a warrior queen. She's very powerful, carrying a shield, and she would have had a battle standard in this hand, but we were unable to restore that, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the king is also gesturing in a regal pose. He is wearing the padded textiles, layered, rich textiles worthy of his status. Next slide. Oh, can I go back for a second? I really just want to point out the step fretting at the bottom of her skirt. Like, the attention to detail on these figurines, the craftsmanship with which they were made is out of this world. And Erin was talking about production technology and mold making. Some of the pieces here are mold made, like the limbs were mold made, the faces were mold made. In fact, most of them have tenoned heads, like she mentioned. Many of them are whistles also, which is kind of cool because not only would they have been laid in the tomb as objects that are part of the mortuary assemblage, but they perhaps were played. They were played as whistles during the ceremony itself for the king buried in the tomb chamber. And blowing that air into those whistles kind of brings us back to that idea of ik, wind, breath, or life, activating these figurines by using them as whistles. Next slide. There's many other characters in the scene, and I'm only going to touch on a few of them just to give you an idea. But we have women holding these looped shawls or some kind of musical instrument. We don't know exactly what those are, but we see that there's body paint or tattooing on these women. We have another woman who is holding a vessel that has tiny ceramic balls in it that probably represent copal incense that would have been burned during the ceremony. Next slide. We also have this young man who is the only other character in the narrative scene besides the king and the queen to be wearing sandals. This is a marker of status. And he's holding an enema syringe, which would have been used to deliver hallucinogens during the context of this ceremony. This is a common practice for cultures all across ancient America, Native America, and the pendant on his neck may represent a hallucinogenic datura pod. So then in the center of this scene, we have these courtiers on the exterior, which also include dancers, and there's a man holding a ball signifying the ritual ball game. We have these more powerful characters in the center. We have, at the axis mundi of the scene, a shaman whose face is contorted in an ecstatic howl, and a number of dwarves who are either boxers or scribes. There's a hunchback scribe, and then there's another dwarf wearing a deer helmet holding a conch shell. He would have blown into that conch shell to create music during the ceremony, but also to open a portal to the underworld to allow the deceased king access. Next slide. So here we have a picture of the shaman that I mentioned. There's also a toad in a miniature container, and what's really cool about these pieces is that they're all containers, and they all contained pigments that were probably specific recipes of body paint. We had those analyzed using a technique called FTIR, Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, and that came back with information telling us about the components of the contents of those vessels. Next slide. Oh, and this is the backside of the shaman, whose pigment was what? Red, holding red pigment. And to this day, there's still a blob of that red pigment inside. And it's so exciting to see that and think about how that pigment might have been used during the ceremony itself. Next slide. Everybody loves the boxers. They've got there's two, I know this makes it look like there's 6 of them, but there are only 2. That they have little removable helmets, like the helmeted figures that Aaron mentioned earlier. They are probably on opposing teams. Notice that they have different designs on their helmets. Not exactly sure which team they're playing for or how they relate to each other, but ritual boxing is a process that would have been used to increase the fertility of the resurrection ritual because it's about bringing rains that bring life. Next slide. So that's kind of a quick overview of this really fantastic scene that when we discovered it was completely destroyed in situ by the ancient Maya themselves. So we had to go through a lengthy restoration and conservation process. Next slide. And that innovative collaboration took place with the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, and our archaeological project, the El Peruaca Regional Archaeological Project, and various institutions in Guatemala, including the National Museum and the Ministry of Culture and Sports. Next slide. So here we are again, looking down into the tomb, and you see that it's this big empty chamber, much like this empty room, space in this room. When we encountered this tomb, it was completely infilled with dirt, rocks, and garbage. So we had to remove all of that before we got down to the funerary bench itself. And as I analyzed the information from that tomb and that context, we realized that, again, the tomb dates from 600 to 650, but the ancient Maya re-entered the tomb themselves between 780 to 820. So they went back into that tomb chamber. They conducted an additional series of rituals that involved burning, because we had evidence of ash and smoke blackening. And then they dismantled the vaulted roof of the chamber, used those flat slates to cover the body of the individual, and then, like I said, dumped in dirt, rocks, and garbage into this chamber. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that all of the fragile materials, all of the ceramics were broken. All the vessels, most of the figurines. It was a very challenging excavation. There's a couple of the figurines in the state that they were when we excavated them. Next slide. So here you can see in situ that the kneeling king and the deer were relatively well preserved. But then we have the king and the queen, their little faces are here, but their bodies, they look good there, more or less, right? You can see that they look coherent, cohesive, and intact. They were blown to bits. Next slide. So this is how they looked when we pulled them out of the field. I had to bag and label every single body component individually. So we would excavate the head, and then the upper arm, and the lower arm, and then the other upper arm, the other lower, the torso, leg by leg, foot by foot, for every figurine, so that we knew that the conservators could do a good job, or the best job possible, to restore this remarkable scene. So I have a secondary PhD in sponge cutting and plastic bag labeling. Good times, not the glamorous side of archaeology, I'll tell you that much. Next slide. Here's our conservator, Griselda Perez, who is still part of the project today. She's a Guatemalan colleague of mine. And under the mentorship of Lynn Grant, who's the head conservator at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and she's written a book called the Maya-Based Conservation Project. She taught Griselda, who was already familiar with conservation of ceramic vessels, but she taught Griselda how to work with this nightmare and conserve these figurines. Next slide. So here, for example, this is the toad figurine as we excavated it, and then during restoration, and then finally in his sort of restored to his former toad-like glory. Next slide. Here's some shots of the king figurine with the, you can see the tenoned head there, and all the different bits of his costuming. And then the bits that we couldn't replace, couldn't restore, weren't there, didn't exist anymore. We had to do some infilling, and then Griselda, next slide, wherever she infilled, would paint a slightly different color. So if you're looking at the figurines in person, you can tell which components of the figurine are restored versus, or infilled and overpainted versus original. But the color, all of the color is original. And so she took her cues from those colors that still existed on those figurines. And then it, like in the case of the battle standard, if she didn't know how to restore something or couldn't figure it out, she didn't do it. So we didn't make anything up here. If we couldn't put the pieces back together, we didn't. And so we have leftover parts. Kind of like they say auto mechanics take their cars apart and put them back together and have leftover bits. I guess we have those leftover bits still. Next slide. But having them be broken like that, next slide, allowed us to do technical analyses that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do, because I can pretty much guarantee you that we wouldn't have been able to drill these figurines if they had been whole for instrumental neutron activation analysis with Ron and Aaron. So I'm not going to go into the whole spiel, because I think if those of you who've seen either Ron's several talks or talked with Aaron or listened to Aaron's talk earlier, instrumental neutron activation analysis basically gives us a chemical fingerprint of where the clay is from that these figurines were made from. Next slide. So Ron and Aaron drilled the figurines prior to the conservation work. So inside, little hidey holes inside of the figurines have the evidence that they were sampled for INAA. And we have found some really amazingly interesting results that I'm going to share with you here today, but that we still need to publish out on. Next slide. And these results tie into ancient Maya geopolitics. This is absolutely one of my favorite images ever. It's from a book called Classic Maya Kings and Queens by Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruba. It's like a subway map. And all of these nodes represent different ancient Maya cities. So we have El Peru Waka here and Calakmul here. I just want to point that out to you right now. And notice all of the lines that go between Calakmul and El Peru. So they're connected pretty seriously during the Classic period. Next slide. And before I make another point, I wanted to say that so this stela is of a ruler of El Peru, a queen of El Peru whose name is Lady Cabell. My colleague Olivia Navarro-Farr excavated a burial in 2012 that we believe is Lady Cabell's burial. We also believe that this figurine may be a portrait of Lady Cabell herself. And so we sort of started using the visual analysis to pull together similarities between these three different possible representations of Lady Cabell. She's holding a shield. She's holding a shield. She has this big plate that's in a position where a shield would be. There's a shell here. This is a shell that's represented on her costuming. Got the battle standard that might have been there, the feathered headdress. These are all just visual clues. This is all a hypothesis, trying to understand the deeper story behind who's represented by these figurines. Next slide. So the results from Ron and Aaron and Dori Renspude and my work with INAA indicates that the fancier, more powerful, higher status figurines were most likely made from clay that came from the city of Calakmul, not from El Peru Waka. All of these other figurines match the signature of El Peru Waka. So what does that tell us? What is that telling us? Because of that intense political connection between El Peru and Calakmul, this figurine scene dates to about the time that Lady Cabell, if this is indeed Lady Cabell, next slide, would have been brought to El Peru, Waka, by her father, the king of Calakmul. His name was Yuknom Chen the Great, to be married off to the heir to the El Peru throne, to the Waka throne. So in that sense, we could be looking not at a couple, not at a king and a queen, but at a king who's bringing his daughter to be married into this other royal family to consolidate power across the southern lowlands. It's very much like a Game of Thrones kind of scenario. You've got people intermarrying so they can consolidate power and control lands. That's what's happening here. And Lady Cabell was probably like, I have to go to El Peru. Because she's from a much more powerful kingdom, a bigger kingdom. She was a more powerful person than her husband. And the archaeology and the epigraphy, the hieroglyphics tell us that. Next slide. One of the other, so this is all an idea in the works. I see those two whispering back there. So I'm sure I'll get an earful later. But one of the other really interesting things about the visual analysis is that there are ritual pairings in the scene. And it took me a long time and staring at pictures of the figurines, like with a glass of wine. I'm like, why is that person standing next to that person? Why is that? And I could never figure it out until another glass of wine later, next slide, I realized that they were paired up with the person across the circle from them. Not next to them in the circle, but across the circle. So the deceased king is paired with a woman holding one of those looped shawls that we talked about earlier, wearing that sassy high slit skirt. The living king is paired with a very similar figurine, sassy high slit skirt, loop shawl. Next slide. The accompaniment or consort, if you will, of each of these kings, so the queen and the deer, are both paired with scribes who are presumably documenting what's transpiring in the ritual. And then all of these lines go through the shaman at the center, who's the axis mundi of the ritual. The dancers are paired with each other. The woman holding the vessel is paired with the man holding the ritual ball game ball. Next slide. And that gives us an insight into how those figurines were arranged very, very purposefully by ancient Maya people. And I'm going to quick give you an exhibition history and then wrap it up, because these figurines, next slide, are like the rock stars of Guatemalan cultural patrimony. They've been traveling the world, but first they were exhibited in the nation of Guatemala because they represent one of the shining stars of ancient Maya cultural achievements. So at the National Museum, they were exhibited. At one point, you can see all these people packed into this tiny room trying to see these wonderful figurines. Next slide. They've also been exhibited at the Kimball Art Museum, and remember that Kimball helped fund the restoration process. And so in the Fiery Pool, which was a show that traveled to several different museums. Next slide. And then most recently, before they were in the exhibition that I curated at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, they were in Germany, and before that they were in the Netherlands, and before that they were in Washington, D.C. These figurines have seen the world at this point. Next slide. But one of the things that I think was missing from all of those other, this is like a plug for my exhibition, it's kind of shameless, but one of the things that was missing from all of those other exhibitions is that they really didn't use this as a teaching tool to stress to people the importance of archaeological provenience. How much more we know about the past when we know it through archaeological excavation. Because without that knowledge, these figurines would have been parted out, sold off in museum collections or private collections, or maybe even brushed aside by looters because they were in bits and pieces. So this is my plug for archaeology, to allow us to look at pieces in museum context that lack that archaeological provenience, but bring an idea to them, think about them as if they had been excavated archaeologically. What would we have learned from them instead? So next slide. I've paired the scene at LACMA with pieces from LACMA's collection that relate to the different aspects of the figurine scene itself. The shell pendant that the king is wearing, there's one in the LACMA collection. There's more toads that are containers, and the toads are like staring at each other in the exhibition. They're having toad talk. We've got jade ear flares and tinkling stone celts that represent jewelry and costuming attributes for the royals. Next slide. But then what I also did was pull 4 different themes out of the narrative scene and array figurines from across Mesoamerica through time and space with those themes. So feasting, music, and dance, manifestations of ritual. That was one of the themes. Next slide. Power plays, war and sport in ritual. The Waka scene has a warrior princess and a boxer. So I pulled this theme out of that and arrayed these other figurines, some of them helmeted, also super cool, with that theme. Next slide. Cycles of life. Because the Waka scene is a resurrection scene, it's about death, I decided that we could easily bring that perspective to other important occurrences that we as humans experience throughout our lives. Next slide. And embodied significance, tattooing, scarification, cranial modification, deformities or anomalies. Those are all things that we can witness in the Waka narrative scene that I have again amassed other figurines that speak to that theme. Next slide. So one of the things that I would like for you to walk away from here today is the idea that archaeological provenience is different than provenance. because all of those figurines that you just saw pictures of that articulate with the themes that I pulled out of the Waka scene, none of them have archaeological provenience. They have what museum people call provenance, and that's a collection history. It's papers that document who owned this, who it was sold to, when did it get transferred to the museum, that kind of thing. These are two very different concepts, but they don't have to be opposing concepts. They're concepts that we can think of in concert because we do have all of these ancient objects that lack archaeological provenience that are in museum collections. They only have provenance, but they can still tell us something about the ancient past. We just need to look at them through the right lens. Next slide. So that's just, I just want to urge you all to think about that. We don't have to talk about it right now, of course. We're going to open this up for questions, but before I leave you, I want to share with you some of the ways in which the Waka figurine scene has inspired creativity in others. Next slide. So, ancient Maya resurrection ritual as creative muse. Next slide. One of our colleagues, Melanie Fournier, is an archaeologist and an artist, and she is doing children's books and cartoons, and she is using the figurines as inspiration for her watercolors. Next slide. Here we have the boxing scene. Got the triumphant boxer and the defeated boxer. Next slide. And we also have ancient Maya, iconic ancient Maya women. This is at a Halloween party. And I know you're going to be surprised to learn that these two are graduate students studying ancient Maya history and archaeology. But we have this beautiful Kalak Mul, back to Kalak Mul again, mural with this woman wearing this beautiful gauzy blue dress. And Carrie Paris is dressed as the Kalak Mul market woman. And Erin Patterson, she's done a splendid job of recreating the costuming from Lady Cabell's outfit in the figurine scene. So inspirational on so many levels, and I'm happy to have, next slide, had this opportunity to share the discovery and conservation and exhibition of the El Peruaca figurine scene with you today. Thank you.